The first time she wrote the diagnosis, she was a third-year resident. Her attending leaned over her shoulder, pointed at the chart, and said, "Religious psychosis, hypnagogic hallucinations secondary to hypoxic event." She wrote it down. She learned the code. She moved on. By the time she had 20 years of clinical psychiatry behind her, she had written a version of that diagnosis more times than she could count. The language changed slightly over the years. The DSM evolved, the terminology shifted, but the core of it didn't. Patient presence with reported visionary experiences following cardiac event, perception of deceased relatives, sensation of bodily separation, belief in afterlife encounter, rule out hypoxic cerebral injury, anesthesia emergence reaction, REM intrusion. She was, by every professional measure, thorough, not unkind. She understood these patients believed what they were describing. She told them so, gently, consistently. Your experience felt very real. That doesn't mean what you think it means about what's on the other side. She said it so often it became a clinical reflex, like checking a pupillary response, like asking someone to follow your finger. She was 51 years old when she flatlined in her own hospital. I'll call her Dr. Sarah M., not her real name, for reasons that will become clear. She practiced psychiatry in a medium-sized Midwestern city, 23 years at the same hospital system, the last 8 as head of the inpatient psychiatric unit. She held academic appointments. She had published papers. One of her publications, I found this later after I read her account, was a literature review arguing that near-death experience reports did not constitute evidence of consciousness persistence after death, and that clinical professionals should exercise caution about reinforcing patients' beliefs regarding afterlife encounters. She published that paper in 2017. She flatlined in 2019, the same year I had my own surgery. Here is what happened to her clinically. She had unexplained chest pain that turned out to be hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a thickening of the heart muscle that can be entirely asymptomatic until it suddenly isn't. During a routine cardiac catheterization to investigate the symptoms, her heart went into ventricular fibrillation. VFib on the monitor, in her own cardiology department, surrounded by colleagues who knew her name. The interventional cardiologist initiated emergency protocol immediately: cardioversion, epipush, compressions, the full sequence. She was in VFib for approximately 3 minutes before sinus rhythm was restored. 3 minutes. In clinical terms, significant. The window where the brain, if you hold to the standard materialist model, begins to generate whatever activity produces what we call near-death experience reports. The window where, if you hold to a different interpretation, something else entirely happens. She came back with full neurological function. She also came back with something that took her 4 months to say out loud. When she finally described it to a colleague, her oldest friend in psychiatry, she started the way trained clinicians start when they're describing something they don't want to be accused of believing. Clinically, standard elements. She recognized them immediately, even during the experience. Out-of-body separation. Observation of the procedure room from above. She described the specific positions of the cath lab staff, the body language of the interventional cardiologist, the way a perfusionist stood slightly apart near the door, arms crossed. Then a transition, movement beyond the immediate physical space, ambient light that didn't come from a source, the quality of it not blinding, but present everywhere, the way temperature is present. She knew the literature. She was running the checklist in real time, even there. And then the life review began. She described it as the most disorienting aspect of the entire experience, more disorienting than the out-of-body, more disorienting than the light. Because she expected the life review to be what she had read in the research. Significant personal moments, family scenes, childhood memories, the kind of content you'd expect from a brain replaying stored emotional material under terminal stress. What she got instead was her office, scene after scene from her clinical career, Specifically, the moments when patients had tried to tell her what they'd seen. She described watching herself from outside, standing beside her own past self, as she sat across from a patient, chart in her lap, pen moving. The patient was a man in his 60s. He'd had a cardiac arrest in the emergency department 3 weeks earlier and had been transferred to her unit for what the ER team had coded as acute psychosis in the context of a medical event. He was trying to tell her about his father, who had died in 1982, standing at the foot of his hospital bed, smiling. He said his father had told him something specific, about a fishing trip they'd taken together when the man was 11, a detail too precise to be general. His father had said, "You know this is real because only you and I know about the fish we didn't catch." She watched herself right in the chart. From wherever she was during the life review, she said it was different from memory. It wasn't a replay filtered through her own consciousness. She described it as watching the scene from a neutral position, the way you'd observe a procedure from the gallery, not from the table. She could see the patient's face as he spoke, something she said she hadn't noticed at the time. She had been focused on the chart, the language, the correct diagnostic framing. From outside, she could see him clearly. She said he looked the way patients look when they need to be believed about something that matters. And she saw her own face, focused, professional, gently closed. She saw this pattern multiple times in the review. Different patients, different years, different rooms. The specific patient data she doesn't share publicly. Those accounts belong to those people, not to her story. But the through line was consistent. The review kept returning her to the exact moments of dismissal, not to her marriages or her graduations or the things she normally thought of when she thought about her life, to the charts, to the pen, to the patient's face on one side of the desk and her clinical certainty on the other. And then something shifted. She said there was a presence, not a figure with a definite form. She was careful about that distinction, careful not to overstate it in the way she had spent a career penalizing patients for overstating it. More like an attention directed toward her. Something aware of her turned her way, in the way that sharing a room with another conscious entity creates a different quality of atmosphere than being alone. She described it as having the quality of a senior colleague beside you in a difficult procedure, someone experienced, calm, who has seen far worse and knows it will be all right. The presence did not tell her she had been wrong. She was clear about this. It didn't speak in sentences. It didn't judge. What she experienced was closer to understanding arriving without argument. She described it as, "I just knew, the way you know, when you finally land on the diagnosis after weeks of differential, that this is it. Not because someone told you, because the pieces fit." The pieces that fit were these. Those patients had been there. What they were describing, what she had been systematically categorizing for 2 decades, was real. Not metaphorically real, not neurologically convenient. Actually real, in some way she didn't have a framework for but could no longer pretend she didn't understand. And then, not painfully but firmly, the way a hand on your shoulder pulls you out of a room, she came back. Now here is the part of this case that I find clinically impossible to dismiss. In the hours following her cardiac event, 2 of her cardiologist colleagues had a conversation in the hallway outside her recovery room. They were debating a post-procedure medication decision, specifically whether to continue anticoagulation given the VFib episode or pause for a monitoring period. The interventional cardiologist argued for continuation. The attending cardiologist disagreed. By both accounts, the exchange became somewhat pointed. At one moment, the interventional cardiologist used a specific phrase, "You're playing checkers when this requires chess." She described that exchange, the exact phrase, the positions of the 2 doctors relative to the door, the fact that one of them had his hands in his coat pockets. She had been, by every clinical monitor attached to her, fully unconscious when that conversation happened. Both doctors confirmed the exchange. Both confirmed the phrase. Neither could explain how she knew it. When her colleague, the psychiatrist friend she first told, sat down to write up the formal documentation of her post-event interview. She told me later that she picked up her pen and almost wrote the language they had both spent their careers writing. The reflex kicked in. The category was right there, waiting. She set the pen down. She sat with the blank chart for a long time. I asked her, when she told me this part, "What did you end up writing?" She said, "I wrote reported post-cardiac NDE, consistent with Greyson scale criteria. And then I went home and didn't sleep for 3 days." If you're not familiar with Dr. Bruce Greyson, I want to take a moment here because his work is directly relevant to what this case exposes. Greyson is the Carlson Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia, which is, I want to be clear, not a fringe institution. He spent more than 40 years researching near-death experiences and developed the Greyson NDE scale, which is the standard clinical tool used to assess whether a reported experience actually qualifies as a genuine NDE. He's a psychiatrist who came to this research as a skeptic. His book, After, published in 2021, is one of the most carefully argued documents I've read since my own experience changed the questions I was asking. What Greyson found over 4 decades, and this matters directly for Dr. Sarah M's case, is that patients who report genuine NDEs score very differently on psychological assessments than patients reporting hallucinations, psychotic episodes, or anesthesia emergence reactions. NDEs don't cluster with pathology, they cluster with transformation. People who score high on his scale show measurable, persistent changes: reduced fear of death, altered values, different relationship to material things, increased compassion. Changes that hold up 5 years later, 10 years later, 20. That is not what pathology looks like. Pathology disrupts. Pathology compounds. Genuine NDE produces what Greyson calls integration, a coherent assimilation of the experience into a changed but functional life. Here's the part I keep returning to. Dr. Sarah M. had read Greyson's work. She had cited it in her 2017 literature review. She cited it as an example of, and I'm quoting her own words back at her, uncritical interpretation of anecdotal data by research programs lacking proper controls. After her experience, she told her colleagues she went back and reread her own paper. She said it was like reading something written by a person who had only ever read about color in a language that had no word for blue. I want to tell you why her case is hard for me to sit with. Not the medical details. Those I can hold. It's something else. After my own surgery, after my own 3 minutes, after I woke up and found myself with knowledge I wasn't supposed to have, the anesthesiologist's words, the exact moment he'd made a small joke to the surgical nurse while my heart wasn't beating. The clinical voice didn't stop. If anything, it got louder. I would lie awake at 3 in the morning and build the explanation. Propofol produces complex dissociative states. Ketamine has well-documented hallucinogenic properties. Hypoxia to the temporal lobes activates patterned sensory experiences. Anesthesia emergence. There's a period of reduced consciousness that can generate elaborate perceptual content. I knew all of this. I had explained versions of it to patients for 22 years. I would build the structure piece by piece, trying to make it hold the weight of what I'd experienced. And every time, it would hold for a few minutes. And then I would remember the anesthesiologist's face when I told him what he'd said, the specific words, the tone, the slight self-deprecating joke. The moment he looked at me and understood that what was being reported back to him was, by the model we both operated in, impossible. The structure would collapse. She describes the same thing. She said the hardest part of the aftermath wasn't the public aspect, explaining herself to colleagues, revising her clinical practice, the awkward conversations about her published paper. The hardest part was the private argument that never fully stops, the part where your training doesn't know how to accept the outcome of its own experiment. She said, "I know what this looks like from the outside. I have been the outside for 23 years. What she changed was not the diagnostic rigor. She still runs the differential. She still checks for pathology. What changed was what she listened for when a patient described the other side. Not what marks the account as disorder. What marks it as real. The specific. The verifiable. The detail that the brain, by conventional understanding, had no mechanism to produce. The fish they didn't catch. The exact phrase in the hallway. The rings on the hand she had never seen. If you work in medicine, in psychiatry, in neurology, in any field where you have made clinical sense of what patients report from the edge of death, I'm not asking you to throw out your training. She didn't. What she did was stop writing that diagnosis as a default. Not because the language changed, because she started asking a different question. Not, how does this fit the category of pathology? But, is there something in this account that the pathology model can't account for? She told her colleague something I've thought about every time I read her account. The patients I dismissed weren't delusional. They were describing a real event. My diagnosis was accurate. The diagnostic category was wrong. I understand what she means. She means the observation was precise, and the framework it was filed into was not. In 23 years of clinical psychiatry, she was very good at her job. The filing system was the problem, not the observation. The last thing she told her colleague before they ended that long first conversation was this. Every chart I wrote that word on, I want to go back and read those cases. Not to revise the diagnosis officially, just to know their names. I don't know if she did. I hope she did.